All right, I think we will go ahead and get started. So welcome to CSL in Session. This is the second webinar in the Everyday Library Evaluation series. This session is going to focus today on data collection. My name is Christine Krieger, and I am the Professional Development Consultant for the Colorado State Library. And before we get started, I want to briefly introduce you to CSL in Session for those of you who may be unfamiliar with our program. You may be used to webinars where there's just a presenter who's going to talk at you for an hour, one-way fashion, but we like to shake things up with CSL in Session. And what we're hoping to do today is engage everybody in a conversation on the topic so that we can all benefit from everyone who is attending their expertise and experience as well. So we're hoping that you'll join in the conversation and share your experiences. Feel free to make comments throughout the session and ask any questions that you may have. The primary way you'll be participating is through chat, although there may be time at the end where you can unmute and ask questions as well. We do ask that you remain muted until the end, but you feel free to use the chat. We are also recording today's session, and the archive will hopefully be available by tomorrow on Libraries Learn. I will also email everybody who registered. We are offering automatic captions for today's session. Participants can turn them on or off using the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you don't see it, you should on the right-hand side at the bottom, click where it says more, and you should be able to turn those captions on or off. Corrected captions will be posted with the archive probably within a week or so. So with that, I am now delighted to introduce today's presenters. We have staff from the Colorado State Library's Library Research Service. So I'm going to let you all take it away.
Thank you, Christine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. We're all good. We can see that. Sweet. So my name is Amy Ballenhorst. I'm the research analyst at Library Research Service. I'm joined by a few colleagues here. We have Dana, Sarah, Carissa, and then Mike Peaver. And Mike is also going to be talking a little bit later in this presentation, going over some examples. So my background is mostly in public librarianship. I worked at Denver Public Library, a couple other systems in the metro area, primarily in children's services. And I'm kind of curious, I would love for people to put in the chat what their role is at their library, just so that we can kind of figure out where everybody stands with evaluation. I'm trying to figure out how to get that. I may not be able to see it.
So
I'm going to stop sharing just for 1 second
yeah.
so I can see. Oh, awesome. So it looks like everybody's kind of all over the place with what they do, which is really wonderful. And it makes a lot of sense that we're all kind of coming at this from different lenses and viewpoints. So we all have a different level of experience with data collection, which is what we'll be talking about today. Before we jump in, I want to ask one other kind of fun question. I am reading a scary story for like the first time ever, a scary book, and I'm kind of curious if people could put in the chat their favorite spooky book. So while you all are doing that, oh no, I can't see the chat again. There it is. Yeah, I'm reading God of the Woods right now, and it's very okay. Awesome. So today we are going to be going over a few different bits. Oh, Taily Poe is so scary. I keep on getting distracted from what I'm saying now. Taily Poe is one of my favorite scary stories. So we're going to be going over some different elements of data collection. We're going to talk through the evaluation and data lifecycle. We're going to go over different data collection methods. We'll do a little bit of logic modeling with focus on outcomes and outputs. We'll talk about when things get a little bit iffy with data collection, and then we're going to do some real world examples and some workshopping. So in the introduction to this webinar, there was a little bit of pre-reading and a suggestion to bring with you today any projects that you currently have going. So while we're kind of working through all this, maybe be thinking about whatever projects you have and some questions that you might want to workshop with the group. In the chat also a little bit earlier, Sarah put a resource guide, and there it is again. You read my mind. Put a resource guide. So if you want to go ahead and open up that link, that would be great. There's a few different documents in there that we're going to be using and kind of going over during this session. Like Christine said, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I finally figured out how to get that working, so that is great. And if I miss anything, feel free to raise a hand or shout it out. I don't mind being interrupted at all. So we are going to jump right into the data evaluation life cycle. If any of you all were here for Carissa's talk about data ethics a couple weeks ago, this will seem kind of familiar to you, but data and evaluation goes through a life cycle just like all sorts of other things. You obviously start with defining a question or problem and defining what your outcome of your research needs to be. Then you will create a collection tool. And then in step 3, we have collection and storage. And that's kind of where we're going to live today, kind of in between step 2 and step 3. But it's important to note that although this looks like a really perfect circle, data collection, evaluation, research doesn't always work like that. It jumps around a lot. So you might collect data and start analyzing it and being like, oh no, I need more data, or I need to store this differently. You might uncover some things in your data and go back to your research question and have to rethink that a little bit or add new questions. You might get to the synthesis piece and jump back to your outcome, and things kind of change all along the way, all throughout. So it's really important to know when you're going through these processes that things aren't quite as linear as you might expect them to be. And so giving yourself kind of some time and patience and flexibility to allow for things to change can be really important. So we are going to talk about some different data collection methods. Does anybody have a favorite data collection method that they want to throw in the chat? I'll say mine has recently become focus groups. We'll talk about those in a little bit. No one has a favorite data collection method. It's all awful, terrible. That's okay. So the first one we're going to chat about is found data. So found data are things like circulation statistics, census information, door counts. And on their own, some of this data can seem kind of plain or boring, but it could also be really interesting if you look farther into it. What Mike is going to talk us through a little bit later is the State Library's book kit resource. And so that includes the book club resource, different kits that you can check out. So they're really cool. Mike is going to go into that later. But within that data, there's both feedback and then there's also circulation statistics. So if you are in the resource guide and you open up the CSL kits statistics document, I think it's a Google sheet, you can see in there kind of the circulation of the kits. And then next to that, you'll also notice different like kind of marketing pushes or other things that happened at the same time as those circulation stats were increasing or decreasing. And one thing that I noticed right away is that the more marketing that was happening, the more circulation there was. Obviously, right? But that's just a great example of, yeah, sure, you just have circulation data, but what else can you kind of uncover from just that simple seeming data? So a question for you all, and you can put whatever you would like to in the chat. Say that you are a storytime provider and you want to start a new story time that is not in English. What kind of found data do you think that you could use to decide what language to do your new story time in? Oh yeah, school data. That's interesting. Yeah, these are all really great examples. Census was the first one that I had thought of when I was thinking through this. But yeah, those are great examples of some found data to help guide your decision making a little bit. So the next one we're going to go over here. Oh yeah, Elena, that makes sense. And just some census errors that we're not even going to go into today, but some issues around the census, especially for non-English speaking folks. Good point. The next data collection method is surveys. I'm guessing most of us have done a survey or at least participated in a survey, super common data collection method. They're really common because they're relatively easy to administer and they don't take a ton of staff or participant time, and they tend to not cost very much money. So because of that, they can be pretty common. You can get both qualitative and quantitative data from them. And they also can be anonymous, which can be really helpful, especially if you're working with sensitive subjects. You can also track data longitudinally really easily with survey data. So they're really useful for that. Paper, phone, online, so a variety of methods there. One thing to consider with this is there's a lot of different software for surveys. So accessibility is one point that you'll hear kind of throughout this conversation. And accessibility in surveys is a really important thing to consider. So when you're looking at what software that you're going to use, if you're going to be doing an online survey, be really careful about what accessibility features that software has. At the State Library, we just switched over to LibWizard, which we like pretty well for both the front end and back end accessibility of it. Obviously, Google or Microsoft Forms are generally robust enough for just kind of average surveys. But if you need something a little bit more complex, LibWizard is great. Qualtrics, if you're rolling around in money, is really great also. Like I was talking about with accessible survey design, Sarah, who I introduced earlier, she has a really great blog on our website, which I think is in that resource guide about accessible survey design. I just want to point out 3 of her biggest points in that, though, which is that surveys have clear features, welcoming language, and are navigable for everybody. It's really hard to make surveys perfectly navigable and usable for every single user. There might be some error in the end that you didn't anticipate. But as you're going through and designing your surveys, just be careful and really thoughtful about who your audience is. So our next data collection method, actually, I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions about surveys or found data? Okay. The next data collection method we're going to get into is interviews. They are a really great way to, in particular, collect qualitative data, so kind of more of those storytelling bits of things. They are generally done one-on-one, and they provide a lot of room for follow-up questions. They're also really great opportunities to build close relationships with people in your community. A really great example is I was at CalCon this past year, and Garfield County Libraries did a really interesting presentation about how they used interviews as a data collection tool. They wanted to kind of rework their strategic plan, and so they had staff, a wide variety of staff in their library system, identify other community members that were considered movers and shakers, so people who were really in the know about their community. And then that library staff went out, did interviews with these movers and shakers, brought back, and from that, they were able to understand the needs of their community really well and move forward with their strategic plan based on that information. So that's a really cool and a really powerful way to engage your community and your staff around data collection. Next method, we have got focus groups. So I mentioned that this has become one of my favorite ways of collecting data. I really like this if you're trying to gain an understanding of what's broadly happening in your community. They're also really good for brainstorming, bouncing ideas off of people in the group. The group part of it can be a little bit tricky. Group dynamics can be a little funny. Sarah has another, I think, great blog about focus groups and managing those dynamics. We could probably do a whole session about that. But you can get some really great qualitative data from it. So we are currently undergoing a research study in prison libraries, and we ran a series of focus groups in there. And it was really interesting to see how the conversations that people within the group had really kind of bolstered the data that we were getting. And I think made it a lot richer than had it just been a one-on-one conversation. They're generally groups of like 6 to 8 people is a good size to aim for your focus groups. Um, Another thing to think about is the focus groups that we're doing in prisons. We're pairing that with surveys as well. So when you're thinking about what data collection methods you want to use, you don't have to choose just one. You could kind of pair multiples together and go about it that way. Observation is the last method. Yeah, Charlene, we will be sharing the slides. Christine will get those out to everybody. I think she's really quick, like within 24 hours or something wild like that. Yeah, sure, you're welcome. So observation, we all do this pretty naturally in our day-to-day lives. It's something humans are relatively good at. But in terms of data collection, there's kind of two different observation tactics. So one can be really formal observation. So say you set up a specific time with a classroom and you go and you do a formal observation of that classroom. In those instances, it's really important to note that as the observer, you may change the dynamic of what is happening. So consider that when you are looking at your data. It's really interesting though to watch people kind of in their natural environment. The other way of going about observation is an informal way. So I noticed myself doing this a lot when I was working in public libraries, just kind of noticing the day-to-day flow of things, or if the weather was bad, what happened to people's moods. Dana and I were talking about this the other day. The change into the fall always changed the dynamics of how people worked. Looking at my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything. Yeah, anecdotal information. So the anecdotal information that you are gathering from these informal observations, take it with a grain of salt. We all carry biases with us, so really be considerate about what your personal biases are, and maybe add in a little bit more formal data collection if you're doing some informal observation. So a question I'm going to pose to you all is if you can share a time in the chat, um, if you can share a time that you gained insight or learned something about your library's community just from observation. Yeah, all the time, Charlene. Exactly. Yeah, Broncos, teens, definitely. Yeah, so it's something that we are regularly doing. This little table I'm showing right here might be a little difficult to read. It came off of LRS's website. It's a great breakdown of the pros and cons of 4 of the different methods that I talked about. So it's in that resource guide. The link to this is in that resource guide, I believe. So it's really handy to refer to. in the future. So some things to consider for data collection. 3 questions to ask yourself when choosing a data collection method. The first one is, what is essential to you? So this is really kind of trying to decide whether you want qualitative or quantitative data, or maybe both. Um, so the how and why of things would be more of the qualitative data, and then the what, how often, and to what extent would be better answered with quantitative data. Next question to ask is, what will you be asking? So complex topics, you might need some follow-up to answers that you're given. So maybe considering focus groups or interviews for that. Taboo topics could require some further anonymity for people. So maybe considering surveys for that sort of information. Another important consideration here is choosing a method that is going to make your participants the most comfortable and feel the safest. So there's kind of this trauma-informed lens that we take with a lot of different things in libraries, and applying that lens to research is also really important. So if you're asking somebody really sensitive subjects, who is the interviewer in that scenario? What room are you sitting in? Did you go to a place where they feel comfortable, or invite dynamics? Just being really thoughtful about whether or not somebody's feeling safe in the environment. So moving on to the accessibility considerations. It's really important to think about all sorts of differences in people when going about accessibility. So cognitive and physical differences, language differences, like I mentioned, location can be really important. Literally being accessible. So is there transportation to get to you? There's a lot of different things that you need to consider when being accessible in your data collection. So an example of this that we had to work through in our prison research is how to survey someone who is in prison whose first and only language is Spanish and they have a vision impairment. That's a really tricky thing, but it's really important, and it was really important to us to capture that type of person, to capture their experiences in their library. And it took a lot of planning and work to try to figure out how to get surveys to that person and people who might speak other languages. But it's really, really vital to do so that you're capturing a good snapshot of your entire community. I mentioned software a little bit earlier in terms of surveys, but if you are not doing surveys, or if you have a bunch of qualitative data, there are a variety of different softwares to use. There's important, of course, cost considerations with this, but for qualitative analysis, and I know this is jumping farther into the life cycle, and Dana and Sarah will go into this more. But for qualitative data, we use a software called Deduce to do qualitative coding and analysis. And so considering some software before you start collecting your data and making sure that you know how that software works is super important. Speaking of cost and time, all of this is going to take a lot longer than you anticipate it to take. I had mentioned that it seems like this perfectly linear cycle, but it's not. And you're going to have to revise things and work with other people's schedules and go back to the drawing board sometimes. So giving yourself some extra time to do all of this, I would highly recommend. And I just wanted to do a little snippet about privacy and ethics. Carissa covered this much more in depth our last session, and Christine recorded that as well. So if you want a little bit more of this, definitely go through and watch that. But there's a lot of different ethical things to consider when collecting data. Privacy is a really, really big one. So if you are telling people that you are going to keep their information private, you need to do that. And you need to have a plan about how you're going to do that. How will you store people's information? How will you de-identify their surveys? How will you destroy the information that you collect eventually? Informed consent is huge. So letting people know what they're getting themselves into. What will their data be used for? That is a vital piece of data collection. There's also this whole concept of vulnerable participants. So there's some federally recognized groups that are considered to be vulnerable participants in research. Those are pregnant women and fetuses, minors, prisoners, persons with diminished mental capacity. This is all quoted, and those who are educationally or economically disadvantaged. So if you're doing any sort of formal research study and you are going to be involving people in these groups, you need to be really considerate of what you're asking, how you're asking it, and whether or not those people can give informed consent. It is also worth considering using a IRB, so an institutional review board, to go over your study and make sure that everything looks good and is ethical to do with vulnerable participants. I put in that resource guide some information from University of Virginia about this topic. They go way more in depth into it, but it's really important to think about. You also want to make sure that you are accurately representing your community when you are collecting data from them. So there's a few different elements to this, but it's kind of this concept of nothing about us without us. So if you're able to incorporate your audience throughout your entire process, that can be a really powerful way to go about research and data collection. So say, for example, you want to find out some information about a program for older adults that you've been doing for years, and you want to survey them about their satisfaction with the program. You could consider asking a couple of regular participants to help you design a survey, get them involved in the work that you're doing. There's also the sample size question here. In that resource guide, I put a sample size calculator for surveys. So that way you can make sure you have a big enough group of people that you are getting responses from in order to accurately represent your community. So any questions up to here?
The only question I've seen come through so far was someone asking if anybody has played with heat mapping for library use patterns. And I think that is physically like in the library versus website heat mapping. But if anybody has experience with that, you can add that to chat.
I do not have experience with it, but I can see the wheels in Dana's head turning as we speak. Alrighty, I'm going to keep us moving forward here. Who has ever played with logic models before? So, maybe some people kind of familiar. This looks a little intimidating. This image is from the University of Wisconsin. The whole concept of logic models is working backwards from your outcome, all the way back to what you need to do, basically. We want all of our evaluations to be useful. And one way to go about that is to start with what your outcome of your program or your study, what you want it to be. So if we start with the outcomes piece of things, and work backwards, then we can really center our work and every single question that we're asking around that outcome. Another presentation I saw at CalCon this year was from Katie Fox, who's at Denver Public Library. And it was really, really great. I couldn't find the slides to it, otherwise I would share them out. But she really talked a lot about in your statement of outcome, who is being centered in that outcome. So, for example, there's a really big difference in the outcomes of our outcome is 4 enriching and interactive story times a week. So that could be one outcome, and in that the staff is really centered. Or you could also have an outcome, which is that children learn to love reading through enriching and interactive story times. The children are centered in that, right? Um, both of those are valid outcomes, but they change the entire rest of the process that you go through based on which one you choose. It seems kind of maybe tedious, but it can be helpful to go through this logic modeling process for every single question that you are asking. And that way you're sure that you're not asking unnecessary information. Carissa loves to give this example of she wanted to put a gender question on a survey, and her supervisor said, well, are there girl books and boy books? And she said, well, no, there's not. And so being really considerate about the questions that you're asking, are you actually going to use that information? And working through this logic model can be a helpful way of doing that. Christine, I see you unmuting.
Yes, I was just going to interrupt briefly because there's a question
Yeah.
in chat that I think fits in here. Is there a rule of thumb for the maximum number of questions or time spent to complete a survey before response quality starts declining?
I don't know the answer to that question. Does anybody else know the answer? Yeah, one thing I can tell you is the software that we used to use for surveying was called Alchemer, and it would give us a score of basically how tiring the software thought that our survey was. Um, I would say probably 10 minutes would be a good guess. Does anybody else have a rule of thumb that they like to use?
I don't have any sort of rule of thumb per se. I was typing up this so I can just say it as well instead of sharing in the chat. But like, yeah, I don't have a specific number of questions or a specific time limit. I would even say maybe like I'm trying to remember what Alchemer said for that score, accessibility score, because that's good to bring up. It definitely let us know. I think it would say it was in the green if maybe it was under 5 minutes even, and then anything above that, it started to kind of give us a little notification if the survey was going too long with that meter that it showed. And yeah, just the shorter shorter seems to be get more responses and more quality responses. I'm thinking of like the Prism survey that was pretty long, where you can tell people start to get tired of those open-ended questions pretty quickly. I usually try to keep the open-ended questions to just a couple, maybe.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah.
Another thing I've seen just as a survey taker, because I got a survey from like my dentist, and you get surveys everywhere, is there might be two versions of the survey where you start taking it and it's to get probably whatever their like is related most to their outcomes, and then they'll ask if you're willing to spend more time.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps or not.
Yeah. I think another thing that you can do to make it, I guess, a little bit more transparent for people is many survey softwares will have like the progress bars, so the percentage complete or an ability to save and continue later. I don't have any like formal data about whether or not those are effective in helping people complete surveys, but I think that that is the intent behind those.
That is an interesting question, though, if any like actual studies have been done about the a more specific time length or length in general for surveys
Yeah.
before quality declines. Now I'm gonna
Yeah.
try to look that up.
Oh, Elena, I love looking at problematic surveys.
I would also
Uh,
think that the positioning of the questions is really important as well.
yeah.
that
Good
like
point.
you're most likely going to get the highest quality responses earlier on than later on. That's intuitive to me. I don't know if it would be very interesting to see if there's any data on this.
Yeah. Okay, so popping back into this logic model, once you've defined your outcome, then you can kind of work backwards to your outputs. So for outputs, we can ask ourselves a couple of questions. The first one being, what do you need to do in order for libraries to achieve the outcome? So you can kind of think of this as the activities that you're doing. And the second question you can ask is, who do we need to reach? And you can think of this as the participation. So once you have kind of the outcomes and your outputs defined, you can start formulating a few different questions. So some questions that you might want to ask yourself could be, what questions can we ask to know if we've achieved this outcome? What questions can we ask people to know if we've achieved our desired outputs? And then, of course, what data collection method or methods can we use in order to best answer those questions? And we'll kind of work through a little bit more of the outcomes situation a little bit later in this presentation. Mike will show us an example of what he's got going on with CS Kits. Are there any logic model questions or experiences with this that anybody feels comfortable sharing? All righty, moving on. So a few different iffy bits of data collection. There is a very interesting conundrum when it comes to longitudinal data. Do you need to keep questions the same for a very long time in order to answer questions well? This is a little bit easier to explain with an example. We do a biannual survey for Colorado Talking Book Library. It's a patron satisfaction survey. And in there is a Likert scale. So basically how people feel about a thing, that the possible answers to are a little bit problematic. As a group, we agree that the answers are problematic, but this question has been asked for so long, and the outcome that the Talking Book Library has really relies on that longitudinal data. And so we've kept that Likert scale the same, even though it's not perfect in our eyes. So know that you can change things as your needs or your outcomes change, but you also don't have to. And that leads me into the next point, which is imperfect data. So no data is ever going to be perfect. We need to use our brains when we are analyzing it, because although, yes, it does tell a story, sometimes there's things missing. Sometimes there's things that you didn't anticipate, things that you wish you had done a little bit better. And then also navigating things that you're forced to collect. So a great example of this is like programming attendance numbers. You're kind of like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll collect the programming attendance numbers without really much understanding of why you need to collect this. Some things are simply just required. So for example, those attendance numbers, those end up getting reported to us in the public library annual survey. And then that data gets further reported up at the federal level. And so that's partially why you're collecting those things. But like, where can you, like I talked about in the beginning of this presentation, how can you read in between the lines and use that data and make it useful for yourself? Some of this stuff that you're forced to collect is actually really helpful too, because further down the line, you might be doing a focus group or interviews and realize that some data that you're already naturally forced to collect is actually really helpful to help make some of that qualitative data a little bit, I don't want to say clearer, but more useful in some ways. So before we move on to our example here with Mike, are there any questions about data collection methods that we can answer? Okay. Yeah, Mike is going to walk us through this example, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes to workshop a little bit. And at the very end of this presentation, there is also a survey, which we would really appreciate you taking, but that link will come later. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Peaver. I am a program coordinator at the State Library. So I mainly work with the networking and resource sharing team, but I also get to work with LRS quite a lot. I help them with things like data entry, but they are the real experts. So I learn a lot from them, but everything that I say, shall be taken with that in mind. So the CSL Kits program is you can sort of think of it as our library of things for libraries, tools for library workers. We have about 50 different types of kits at the moment, and we lend them out to libraries for 8 weeks at a time. So we have everything from VR headsets to passive programming in a box to games kits, archival technology, early literacy kits. We got a lot of different kits, and we're always interested in branching out, making new and interesting kits that are hopefully very useful. We also have quite a large collection of book club sets, and I think of it is a separate collection, but it falls under the same program really. So thanks for putting that link in there, Dana. And you also find links in the resources that Sarah shared out earlier. But very briefly, our outcomes are focused on kind of enabling less resourced libraries to create programming or have access to resources that they otherwise wouldn't, and helping them kind of with underserved populations. So this slide here that you're seeing shows the purpose and the outcomes there, and that's taken directly from our 5-year plan, our current five-year plan, which lives on the IMLS website. So if you're interested in pulling that up, go to your favorite search engine and just type in Colorado State Library 5-year plan, and it should be the first result. But I think I'm throwing it back to Amy now because she's going to home in on one of these outcomes and maybe do a little bit of brainstorming before I take it back.
Sounds good. So one of the outcomes in that 5-year plan for this, the circulating resource kits, is that libraries with limited budgets will be able to expand programs and materials to better meet the needs of their patrons. So some questions for you all to put in the chat. What do you think the outputs of this for this outcome could be? So what do we need to do in order for libraries to achieve the outcome, and who do we need to reach? Yes. Yes, both true.
Yep.
So also to put into the chat, what questions can we ask to know if we've achieved the outcome of libraries being able to expand their programs and materials to better meet needs? What's an example of a question we could ask to know if we've achieved this outcome?
And should it involve a Likert scale? That's the question.
Yeah, I like this question of how are they using them with their patrons?
Yeah. Some great suggestions.
Does
I'm taking
anybody have
notes.
have a suggestion of what data collection method would be best to answer some of the questions around this outcome. Would it be best to survey people, run focus groups?
Seems like you have kind of a built-in baseline data because you know what libraries, you know all the libraries that are already there, and you already know libraries that have been checking out the kits. So in reverse, there's a list of libraries who are not. So then you could throw that limited budget parameter on it, and now you've got a list of libraries that you could target marketing at. So your outcome would be, did any of those libraries check out a kit who had not checked one out before? So you've got a baseline, and then you've got a measurable outcome right off the bat.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example, like Christine put in the chat, of using found data.
Yep. That's a really good point, Dana, and something that I need to explore for sure. But it's also like, it's voluntary, you know, to join the program. So it's like,
right.
Just letting them know is sometimes not enough. I got to find strategies to make it appealing. And I think one of the things that we run into is that everything's shared via the courier. So there is a little bit of an impediment there, and lag time and things like that, which may turn some folks off. I don't know.
Someone else put into, excuse me, chat that said that qualitative would be helpful. How are they being used? So those stories can be shared with libraries not utilizing the kit. So those stories would help with marketing. And then someone else says, what makes you hesitant to use a CSL resource kit?
Yeah, those are really good.
Definitely. Yeah. These are all great suggestions, and in some ways, Mike is already doing using some of these questions. So he is using a variety of different data collection tools. And in the, it's linked in the resource guide, but it's that circulating kits stats. You'll see that includes feedback. So some of those qualitative stories that people tell about their experiences with the kits, as well as some of the circulation statistics.
Yeah. So yeah, like Amy said, we are collecting data. It will help towards measuring how successful we are in sort of meeting these outcomes, but it is a work in progress. So yeah, feel free to check out some of that circulation data, but we'll just check out the feedback forms together here. If you've ever requested one of our kits, probably not, I don't recognize any names, but each kit comes with a paper feedback form. And this is the form that I inherited and was circulating, I think, for quite a few years. But we weren't getting many responses on it. As you can see, it's 2 pages long, quite a lot of questions on it. And I kind of got the sense that these questions were added over a long period, and it sort of became a little bit bloated, so that, you know, it was still getting useful feedback, but we weren't getting a lot of responses in general. So we just had very little data, and the data that we were getting was not really that useful even for reporting purposes. So some of that more forced collection, it wasn't even useful for that. So it was more kind of anecdotal. So my goal was to kind of increase responses for a start and get some actual quantitative data that would line up well with what IMLS is looking for. And it also just gave me a realization, which I think is something that Carissa talked about, which is don't just collect data for its own sake, really. You need to have really clear intentionality at all points of the process. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is the new survey, and it's circulated for pretty much most of this year. And we're getting a lot more responses on this. So you can see, you know, it's way more focused, and the questions are much more focused. and useful for that quantitative data. And I think it's just a bit more psychologically more appealing to fill out. I also am more transparent with what the data is being used for there in that paragraph at the top. There is a digital feedback option, so they can scan the QR code. And they did have the option, there was a link on the old one as well, where they could have typed the link in painstakingly, but they have a QR code, and that will take you directly to the Google form now. So yeah, we're getting useful data, and we can start analyzing this data with the outcomes in mind pretty much whenever. One approach that I've thought about, and somebody kind of hit onto it, was tying the individual feedback about individual kits to those libraries, and then looking at other types of data like the Public Library Annual Report data, for example, and then just getting a much better feeling for how we're even approaching meeting these outcomes. And that's going to take some analysis as the data set builds. And I think as we get more data, we'll get clearer trends as well. So we also keep the space for them to write their thoughts about the kit or the KITS program in general. That's something that I really want, is this kind of big picture feedback as well. But the big realization that I had was the context is so important when they're feeding back with these forms. And I think when they're encountering them is when they're about to return the kit to us. So they kind of want to get it off their plate, maybe doing inventory ideally on the kit. And yeah, they're not really poised for thinking broadly about the program in that moment, or giving me very specific feedback on logistics and things like that. So I've streamlined it. It's better, like I said, getting more useful data, but I am missing some of that big picture data on a lot of different aspects to do with the service, the logistics, etc. So we need more data, and I am doing the smartest thing, which is working with the experts, LRS, on creating another survey. And this won't go in with the kits, so it'll be circulated through a mail merge or something like that. So already the dynamic is quite different there. They may be more willing to, say, pull up the collection on the website and take a look at it and give me some of that more overarching feedback. So I also encourage you to do the same, really. LRS is there for you, and it's a resource for you to talk through these things and guide you. And yeah, take advantage of that. So we're going to turn it on you again.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for showing us that example.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks for the promo. Like Mike said, if you all have any questions after this or any projects that come up, we are more than happy to help anyone. Does anybody want to bravely volunteer in the next, say, 3 minutes to tell us about a project that they are working on, and maybe work through a couple of these items on the screen? You don't even have to show your face. You would never know. Well, that's okay, because I came up with another example that we can just work through together in preparation for people being shy, which is totally understandable. Here's a fun scenario. You work in a public library and you have unlimited money. What? So cool. So unrealistic, but what a dream. You want to start a book club, and you want it to focus on a certain genre or topic. How will you decide what the topic will be? So we are going to start with an outcome. What would an outcome of this project look like?
People sign up to be part of it.
Yeah.
And show up to be part of it.
And have fun while they're participating.
Yes.
In the chat, we have start new book club based on community interests.
I think personally, I might even take it. Oh, yeah. One tiny step farther, and maybe this is too far, but to say something like, community members will have deeper relationships with the library because of participation in the cookbook book club, right? And that could be an outcome of the entire project.
And we also have, why do you want to do a book club, which isn't necessarily an outcome, but probably one of the questions that you'll ask kind of
Yep.
along the way. And then potentially the book discussion ends up being a community read event without the library having to push it.
That would be a beautiful thing as well, with your unlimited money. Are there any other questions to ask that would help you understand if you had achieved the outcome or the outputs? These are all great, and thanks for putting things in the chat. One last thing to put in the chat, what data collection method would you use in order to help answer some of these questions? Or methods would be a strategy around that. Obviously, it depends on the outcome that you choose. Yeah, a variety.
I was gonna say observations as well, Jennifer. Thanks for throwing that in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see all these different ideas and the fact that nobody had the same idea and there's not one simple solution to what seems like a pretty basic question or a pretty basic idea for a program. So yeah, it's the adventure of data collection. Oh, Daphne, yeah, that's a great idea for an outcome, and then also easy thing to track with circulation, right?
And someone else asks, is it possible to gather data on community social media conversations on titles to identify what is popular?
That's a great idea.
Ugh, somebody would have to be on social media though. Whoa.
I do belong to a psychological thriller book club or book group
Ooh.
online.
Hey.
So.
All right, you all. Here is the survey that we would love for you to take. It will ask for presenter names and the presentation or the program name. I also threw on here our contact information. The LRS one will go to the whole team. Obviously, Mike and my email will just go to us. And yeah, if you have a moment to fill out that survey, we would super appreciate it. And thank you all so much for coming today. And yeah, any questions, please reach out.
So I just want to take just a quick moment to thank LRS for doing this series for us. And this is the second one. As mentioned before, we did record the session and we will send everybody who registered a link to the archive, which will also have the resource list. And it'll let you know how to get a certificate if you need one. So you can look for that in the next day or so. So I really want to thank the presenters and thank everybody for your attention. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon.